Hello and welcome to Profiles in Risk. And this is your host, Tony Cañas. I'm recording episode, 230, something. I don't really know. Today, my guest is Brian Ahearn. I think I got that somewhat correct with
You got it
Influence
correct.
People. So Brian, thank you for being here today. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Tony. It's great to be with you.
So Brian and I connected just before he retired from a long career at State Auto, one of my favorite insurance companies, and I was blown away when you mentioned during that chat that you are one of only 20. I think I have the number correct. Cialdini Certified Trainers.
Correct. There are 20 of us across the globe, and I happen to be one of those people and the only person in the insurance space.
So, and I am a gigantic fan of Cialdini. I've read his books, done videos about them. It's helped immensely in my own career, especially for the last 3 years that I've been in sales. So huge fan. And before running into you, I had no idea that he even had a certification program. So anyway, just like we always do in the podcast, I'll kind of give you the chance of doing your elevator pitch, and then we'll just kind of chat.
Okay, great. Well, first thing I would say is I never use the word retired. I did leave State Auto, but I work more days and longer hours than I ever have before, and I love it. I absolutely love it. I started my insurance career right out of college with the Travelers, knew nothing about insurance, liked the pitch that I heard from the guy who's the senior vice president that I'd ultimately be reporting to. And I loved it. I met my wife the very first day of work. It was her first day out of college. That's actually mentioned in my book, The Psychology of Me Asking Her to Marry Me. And then I moved over to State Auto Insurance.
So, hold on. You met her first day of college? Is that or
first day on the job with the Travelers.
Okay. I was gonna say I don't know if you're a fan, but How I Met Your Mother, two of the main characters, Marshall and Lily, met first day of college. So very similar story. Anyway, continue.
So I always say I loved my time at the Travelers because I met my wife and I got great training. And then I moved over to State Auto, where I spent the rest of my career while I was officially in the industry. Commercial underwriting, started as a personal underwriter, but commercial underwriting, sales, ran the corporate university for a number of years at State Auto Insurance. But during the time when I was involved with sales training is when I bumped into Cialdini's work, and I knew very quickly that it was what I would want to do with the rest of my career. So I started planning a decade ago in terms of when I left State Auto to build a foundation of something to step into. And I made that choice towards the end of 2018. And now what I do is I work with insurance companies, insurance agencies, and also entities outside of the industry, teaching them about the science of influence and how do you apply it to get to better business results.
I think this is so important for industry because there's a million sales trainers out there, but my issue with most sales trainers is if you were that good at sales within our industry, you would probably focus the great majority of your time selling because it's so profitable to sell within insurance, right? So it's one of those like those who can do and those who can't teach. So what I really love the way you came into it is that Cialdini's work is scientifically based, it's empirically based, right? It's research based. Right. So if I can't get, somebody that did so like I'm in sales myself. I sell staffing services to insurance companies, high level staffing services. I would love somebody who did this for 30 years, right, and knows exactly how to do this. But if I can't get that, I'd rather get somebody whose sales methodology and training is empirically based.
Yeah, I agree 100%. When I bumped into Cialdini, it was by coincidence. A coworker gave a video to myself and my boss at the time. When I watched that video, it was Robert Cialdini presenting at Stanford and the light bulb came on. I thought, holy cow, this psychology explains all of sales. It's why certain sales approaches work and why certain ones don't, but it's the underpinning of selling. I also really liked his stance on ethics. He talked about non-manipulative ways to get people to do things. And then, as you've already alluded to, it was all empirically based. This wasn't my good advice or somebody's good advice. You could look to the research and see the significant difference that it made based on the different approaches. And so I started making it the foundation of everything I was doing in terms of the sales training and the sales coaching that I was doing at State Auto Insurance.
And you mentioned the ethical aspect of Cialdini, and if I'm not mistaken, his last book, Persuasion, he makes it explicit. He's like, I've gotten a lot of recognition for research on how to convince people to do things, but I want to make it super clear that ultimately I'm teaching you to defend yourself against the dark arts of persuasion.
Well, it's interesting, Tony, that if it were not for the word manipulation, I would not be sitting here and doing what I'm doing.
Interesting.
And that's because I was so enamored by that video that I started using it in some training. I'd show it to groups, we would talk about it, and I signed up for Stanford's marketing. Well, one day, one of their marketing flyers comes across my desk, and I'm flipping through the pages, and then boom, there's Cialdini's picture. And it says in bold letters, bestseller, right underneath it, call it influence, persuasion, or even manipulation. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe they actually use that word. What copyright individual would think that advertising manipulation would make for good sales? But more than that, he was so clear in that talk about non-manipulative ways. So I emailed Stanford and I basically said this: I don't know anybody who wants to be manipulated, and I don't know anybody who's looking to become a good manipulator. The word cannot be helping your sales, but it's probably really hurting. I never heard from Stanford, but sometime later my phone rang and it was Robert Cialdini's office. And one of his reps said, I'm calling to thank you on behalf of Dr. Cialdini. You sent an email to Stanford, and because of that email, they're changing the marketing of all of our materials. And I was like, wow, that is really cool. And we had this nice conversation. And before we hung up, she said, if your company is ever looking for a guest speaker, Dr. Cialdini travels the world and talks about this. And I said, I sit next to the woman who books our events and speakers. You want to talk to her? And as fate would have it, Tony, it was the summer of 2004. He was in Columbus several times to address the agents that represented the company. And that's what got the ball rolling. So again, if it were for the word manipulation, I wouldn't be talking to you today.
I can only imagine. So it reminds me a lot when I was at Nationwide's young professional group or the Gen Y Associate Research Group. Jason Ryan Dorsey, the guy who wrote Why Size Your Business. I've built my career on bringing his ideas into insurance, and we had an opportunity to bring in a speaker. So I called his office to see how much he charged to speak. Turns out that I want to say it was like $10,000, and we didn't have the budget. So I can only imagine like you get told that Cialdini would love to speak at State Auto. You sit right next to the person. I can only imagine you go over the cubicle and be like, "Hey, can I get $15,000 for the best speaker ever?"
It was probably the highest rated leader conference that we ever had, because
of course,
agents were smart enough to know, hey, this is the foundation of selling, what he's talking about.
By the way, you talked about being involved in State Auto University, which, if I'm not mistaken, is their internal training. Were you also involved with Pacesetter, the agent side training?
I was not directly involved with Pacesetter. That was part of the sales department that I was in, but I was doing training with agents. So I took Cialdini's, what was called or is called the Principles of Persuasion workshop, and we kind of morphed it so it was more of a sales offering. So we would talk about all the same principles, but I put a kind of a sales spin on it, and was able, because my audience was always agents, able to make the examples and all the activities very tight to insurance. So it was separate from Pacesetter, but it was a sales offering that we made.
Okay, makes sense. So recently I made a video about Cialdini's main book, and I tagged you on it, and I was happy that you thought it was good. But you mentioned that you had written your own book, and then just like a week ago, you published your second book. So tell me about the books.
Okay. Well, the first book is called Influence People. That's the name of my company. And the word people is an acronym. So it's the subtitle for the book: Powerful Everyday Opportunities to Persuade that are lasting and ethical. And that's my framework. Powerful, we talk about the science. It's an everyday skill. There are opportunities out there that most people don't even know because they don't understand the language of persuasion. If you do it well, it can be a lasting impact. And of course, it has to be ethical. So the first book kind of dove into those principles. I don't go deep in the research. Cialdini's the guru. That's the book you want to read. My book was all about application. So we looked at business case studies. We looked at things that I saw or actually used in the work world, social media use and things like that. The second book is called Persuasive Selling for Relationship-Driven Insurance Agents, and it's very tight to the sales cycle. So I introduce the principles of influence, and then we look at the 8 steps in the sales cycle and which principles are most effective at each of those steps. And then I give lots of examples, all insurance related. One other thing that we do in the book too is we look at different personality styles and which principles are most effective when dealing, for example, with a driver personality or an expressive, an amiable, or a logical. So that's kind of the framework for the book.
Okay, so book one really sounds, and tell me if I'm wrong. It sounds like a study guide. Okay. How do I put it? So study guide was one way to think of it. Okay. So personally, right? I read Influence a couple times. The second time to make the video, and it's very interesting. There's a lot of theory in there, right? There's a lot of theory in there, and it always, the examples generally don't come from sales. The examples generally come from I would say sociology, psychology more than anything. And I want to apply it to sales, right? So would you say that book one is kind of like applying Cialdini's research
Absolutely.
to sales? Okay, perfect.
Well, it wasn't specific to sales. It was on a broader level business.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly lots of sales examples in there. The reason that I wrote the first book was having worked with his material at that time for a decade, and I would put agents through a 2-day workshop, and they still were craving more examples. They wanted to see the application. People read his book and they're fascinated by it, but they don't know necessarily how to turn around and put it into practice. So that book was really about the practical application of his work. The second book is very tight to the sales. And so, when you're prospecting or first meeting or objection handling, presenting, all of those steps in the sales cycle, that's where we look very specifically which principles are most effective and why, and then give lots of examples throughout each of those chapters.
Perfect. I'm curious. So like myself, you've never, I don't think, worked at an agency or a brokerage. Like myself, you're a former underwriter. So we both look at the way insurance is sold for a little bit from a third party view. In your case, you actually trained agents, so you've got a lot deeper into it than me. But I get a lot of career calls from young agents, whether they've been recruited to work at a State Farm agency, like a little local State Farm, not big national State Farm, or they're going into a commercial broker type role. Anyway, and I don't have much advice for them because I've never done it before. What I can tell them is this is one of the hardest jobs in the industry, but long-term, one of the best rewarded if you survive. And also the survival rate is very low. So I generally, number one, tell them I've never done it. I point them to Ryan Hanley's stuff. I point them to Agency Nation. I point them to, I'm looking all over the place because I'm looking for my copy of The Wedge. I point them to The Wedge. Yeah. Which I have not read, but I finally have a copy. It's so expensive, and since I'm not a broker, I didn't want to buy one. But I finally have a copy, widely popular. And so I point them to a couple of books like that. But so what I'm curious, long with the question, long way to ask, what is it that you think is missing in most brokerages or most agencies that is leading to low survival, low success rate of producers?
Okay. Well, I think there's a number of things, and that Pacesetter program that you mentioned with State Auto did a fantastic job.
I've heard great things about it.
One of the biggest problems, I think, is so many smaller businesses. I know some brokerages are extremely large, but a lot of the independent agencies are still not really large and don't have the capacity to bring people in and do a tremendous amount of training. And so I literally had met people who were hired on the strength of their personality, in a sense, given yellow pages or a list and said, start making cold calls.
Good old fashioned way to train an agent.
It was almost like throwing everybody overboard on a cruise ship and saying, if you can't swim, you'll learn. And if you don't, it was nice.
We'll hire somebody else.
Yeah. And so I think that's a huge problem. But then the other side of that is a lot of them feel like they don't have the resources to pay to have somebody go through that kind of training. And so now you're not providing it, but you're also not giving the resource to get somebody over to the other side so that they can do that. Now, even those who provide it, I think you need to, I mean, somebody could go through my workshops and learn a tremendous amount, but the rubber meets the road when you begin to put it into practice. And do you have mechanisms internally to hold people accountable to what they learned? Are you coaching them so that you're replicating the best parts of you with them to create something even better in terms of that producer? And again, I think that's something, it's a resource issue where everybody's running and gunning and feel like they don't have time. But you've got to look at whether it's training or coaching as an investment, that the time and the resources that you put in, if they're good resources and whether that's money and training, they will pay dividends. And that's always when we make an investment, we want that investment to pay us more over the course of time. And you've got to be able to view it that way. Otherwise, when you look at it as an expense, you're just looking at time away from the office and money out the door, and you're never going to succeed with that mindset.
Okay, so if a listener owns an agency or a brokerage, small or medium sized, likely if they're listening to me, and they're they just hired a couple of new producers, or they're looking at hiring a couple of new producers. So I don't think that that you offer the service of helping them hire, right?
Correct. That's not my niche.
So they've hired a couple of new producers. How can you help them? What does it look like? What kind of commitment is it? What's the service that you offer for a group like that?
Well, what I typically do is work through insurance agencies or insurance companies. And so an agency might say, hey, we've got, and so sometimes this is the bigger, aggregators, nationals, whatever you want to call them. And we're going to bring in a group of newer producers. And so I might go in and interact with them. And there's a number of things that we offer. I do the 2-day workshop that we call Principles of Persuasion, which dives really deep into the psychology. I've got a 1-day workshop that revolves around the new book called Persuasive Selling, which really looks at the principles and the application throughout the sales process. And then we also talk about, you mentioned the book Persuasion. Got a workshop where we talk about how do you persuade, how do you set the stage before you even attempt to persuade somebody so that you up your odds of success. So those are all offerings that I have. I also do one-on-one coaching. So somebody might come to me and say, hey, I don't have time to go through this, but I really want to hire you to coach me and teach me and hold me accountable. And so when we do that, there's a lot of teaching, there's a lot of homework, there's a lot of review. And then sometimes organizations just say, hey, Brian, we just want you to come in and tell us what to do. We want you to look at the sales process, tell us where we have opportunities so that we can put these things into practice. So that's how I generally interact with different organizations.
The coaching piece, do you have, are you able to be hired either by the agency itself or just by a single producer looking for help personally? Yeah. Okay, yep. Perfect. And when they bring you into a carrier, which is where you spend most of your career, are you usually coming in to train the ultimate agent or to train the sales managers or both?
It depends on what they want. Sometimes it's to work with that company and maybe they bring some of their better agencies in for continued training. Within the insurance company, a lot of times where you see the biggest bang for the buck is working with the field salespeople, people who are walking into the independent agent's office.
Favorite job in the industry.
Because you can clearly see, once you put training into place and then what kind of impact is that having on the results. It can be a little tougher to see it when you're working with underwriters, but underwriting is still a persuasive conversation too. And a lot of underwriters get into underwriting because they don't want to be in sales. And so I avoid using the word sales with them, but they absolutely grasp that they are trying to persuade their agents on price and coverage and conditions and any number of other things. And then another area is claims. settling a claim is absolutely a persuasive conversation. So working with an organization, understanding what their claim process is, and then starting to strategize about how to put these principles into play in those conversations with the hope of, if we can get you as claimant to do the things you need to do so we can settle your claim faster, that's a win for everybody.
Absolutely. And the underwriting piece, you're absolutely right. And not only that, I didn't even think of it as a former underwriter, didn't even think of it. And there is a transition in the industry that I see every day as I chat with business unit leaders in the underwriting space. And it's basically a transition away from what I would call desk underwriting, which was the underwriter only in charge of loss ratio, not at all not at all measured on growth. Transitioning from that to more of a production underwriter who has responsibility for both growth and loss ratio. And as we transition to that, we're going to have to give a lot of support to the underwriter. Technically not selling, but a lot of influencing. Definitely.
Absolutely. And there, with so many companies, there's a disconnect there. It can be viewed sometimes as, my sole responsibility here is profit. And the growth piece, if it comes, great. If it doesn't, that's okay, because I am measured on profit. Obviously, if you're on the sales side, you could go the other way and say, it's your job to give the right price. It's just my job to push it all in the door. And there really has to be kind of a middle ground there, where underwriters should be held accountable to certain growth goals, but also with the profit there. And now you've got this balancing act. You can't just say, this doesn't meet our criteria, therefore I don't want it. You've got to start saying, how can we work together? And that's where the influential conversation comes into place. Can I get that agent to do what I believe we need to generate that profit, but still make that sale?
And now that I think about it, you're talking about flexibility. A lot of carriers are attempting. So Nationwide is the first one that comes to mind. For the last several years, they've been attempting to move from a personal lines and small commercial carrier to a middle market carrier. Mm-hmm. Well, middle market, a big part of it is finding the terms at which, right? It's not just can we do it, can we not do it, how's our price? It's how can we find ways to do it profitably for the good of the broker relationship, so that they keep coming to us, right? There's a lot more flexibility, and that flexibility requires you to learn how to persuade the agent and help the agent persuade the client, the ultimate client.
Transition. I remember, if I go way back to when I started in the insurance industry, and I was a personal lines underwriter, and when we had to make underwriting decisions on the personal lines, it was either, is this a non-standard, a standard, or a preferred risk? I mean, that was it. You were just making a judgment call based on what you knew about the agency, the risk, and the underwriting guide. When I shifted over to commercial, and the first time I was given a risk, and the manager said, so what kind of credit did you put on it? And I'm like, what do you mean credit? And he's like, well, you could give it up to a 25% discount if it's good, or you could have debited it. And I'm like, non-standard, standard, preferred. That's all I knew. So that was a transition. But when you go from writing like BOP type business, small commercial, into middle market, it's not necessarily exactly the same. Yes, it's within insurance, and yes, it's commercial. But think about like people who go from high school football to college. It's a big change.
Big change.
There are All-Americans in college who don't make it in the pros. Huge change. And I really think when you go from small to medium to large account solutions, you've got those jumps. And not everybody ends up making those jumps. They just can't seem to break away from what they already know and how they do things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I did a video a few weeks ago on the different types of different underwriting jobs, what the day-to-day is like. Based on what I've seen, and yeah, it can be radically different. Yes. This is a bit of a departure, but from what we've been talking about. But I noticed that you took the same class at Duke that I took, the Beginner's Guide to Irrational Behavior by Dan Ariely. Yep. And personally, I'm a big fan of his stuff too, and it really, when Lemonade came around and hired him or as a consultant or whatever, brought him into the insurance space, I was super excited. Now, after a few years, I'm a little disappointed in how they've used Ariely. Any thoughts? Feel free to just no comment, and I'll just cut this section out.
I haven't followed them closely.
Okay.
And I do think, though, that what I was observing and things that there's going to be a tough transition. I think it is not going to be nearly as easy as they think in terms of generating the profit that they need to long term to make sure that they still get the investment dollars. I think the whole wave that we've seen into insurtech and the changes and things like that, there's going to be a lot of people who break ground and fall away, but what they did is going to catapult some others, so that, you know, maybe in 5 or 10 years, that's going to be the norm, and some of the more traditional insurance companies are starting to fall by the wayside. I love Dan Ariely's work too, but I do think that some of his comments were overly simplistic as somebody who's been rooted deeply into the insurance industry. Just like I could make oversimplified statements about airlines and how they price things, because I don't know the details that they go through.
Yeah, I agree completely. I was just curious, since I happened to notice on your LinkedIn that we had that in common. If somebody is looking at bringing you on, I mean, I'll tag your LinkedIn and company website on the podcast. What does the process look like when they do? What does the process look like? Do we have a quick conversation and I'll give you all the options I have, or what does the onboarding look like, so to speak?
Typically, people either reach out to me directly through my website or through LinkedIn if they're proactively like contacting me. Now, I do a whole lot of prospecting on my own. I've been talking to a lot of people and a lot of companies, and it all depends on what it is that they're looking for. Not every need is the same. As I mentioned, I've got several offerings, and those offerings can also be morphed to meet the particular needs of the organization. So it always starts with the detailed conversation of where are you now? Where are you trying to get to? What are the challenges that you are facing? Let's talk about how what I'm doing might help with those challenges. And if we agree that there's a way for us to work together and that what I'm doing will help them get there, that's when we decide exactly how we're going to approach it.
Excellent. And last, I'm curious, for those like myself, to carry the work into the future, that are thinking of pursuing a certification like the Cialdini certification in the future. What does it entail? Because the fact that there's so few of you guys makes me wonder, like, the way, do you have to climb Everest barefoot with carrying your own backpack without using a Sherpa? Like, how does it work?
No, it's not quite that hard. First of all, he and his organization practice what they preach. So the principle of scarcity, right? You're incredibly intrigued because there's not hundreds of us around who are doing this. So that's
it works.
Curiosity. So that approach is working on their behalf. I will say that they probably could certify more people, and as an organization probably generate more revenue, but that is not why he started Influence at Work. First and foremost, he is most concerned with the pristine presentation of his life's work. And you've seen, I'm sure, because you're well read and you watch videos and things where people hear something, and by the time the 10th person is saying, you're like, that's not true. I mean, probably the most misapplied is Albert Morabian's 55% of what we say is body language, 38% is tone, and 7% is words. That's not true.
Okay.
That was only when people are doubting what the speaker is saying, and yet people get up and use that as a general thing to basically say people are going to remember more about what you wore than what you said. Not true. And so with that understanding, he is concerned about how people are going to take, these decades of work, and they're going to share that and help people apply it. So because of that, he keeps this group very tight. Typically what you need to do is, the first thing is you have to go through their 2-day workshop. if you then say, wow, this is something I love this, then there's a pretty rigorous application process. They want to know about your background, what your potential market is, how you would utilize this information, because you are basically a franchisee. So I have my own company, but I represent influence at work at times, and then other times I'm doing influence people. Then you go through a week of training. So let's say they said, hey, Tony, you're great. You know, you look like you got all this potential. You spend a week with Dr. Cialdini and his partner, Dr. Greg Neidert, getting in-depth training on the research, how they do the workshop, why they do the things that they do. And even once that's happened, you're still not out of the woods, because you still have to then put on a workshop and get audited. And there have been people who've gotten all that way and then not been able to handle the material and conduct the workshop in a way that they would say they want it representing. So it's a rigorous process. They take in maybe 2 people a year now to go through that type of training. So you get super hands-on, and it's pretty intimidating. You know, I had to teach back to Dr. Cialdini and to Dr. Neidert, and you know, here's the guys who wrote the book, and I'm teaching them. But it worked out because here I am.
Excellent, excellent. So that's all I've got today, Brian. Thank you for joining me. For the listeners, having been an underwriter, having a sales manager. The only thing I've never done is be an agent. Having been in sales for the last 3 years, selling a really weird service within our industry. I personally, like I said earlier, would love training that comes from an empirically based research, and that is taught by somebody who's certified to teach it. So in my opinion, it's a no-brainer to go for you, especially since you're already from the insurance industry. So you know, a hearty recommendation on my part. And also, you recently got a really good review from my good friend at Westfield. So by with names,
Eddie,
yes, Eddie Rivero,
yeah.
Riviero or Rivero.
Yes.
I think it's Rivero. Eddie Rivero. So again, yeah, that's more than enough for me to be confident that I'm not gonna get an angry email later telling me that I made a crappy recommendation. So thank you so much for joining me today. Can't wait to see you expand your practice with an insurance, because holy crap, we need it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.